Hi, my name is Michael Savoldi. I was a farrier science instructor at, at the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, California. I also was a resident farrier for the W.K. Kellogg Arabian Horse Center, which is located on the Cal Poly campus. Today's discussion, I would like to talk about distortion to the sole plane. Now, this is a subject that we haven't discussed much before. It has to do with the welfare and health of a horse's foot. When the sole plane becomes distorted, that will affect soft tissue and eventually affect the bone of the inside the foot. So we will focus on an upward bend in the heel area. We can talk about a horizontally planed hoof capsule, and we can talk about a horizontally planed P3 bone. But now I'd like to talk about a horizontally planed sole plane. So starting with some basic anatomy, I'm going to start with a cadaver limb that was collected at a local rendering plant. And it's used for research purposes and educational purposes also. So you will see some gross anatomy pictures in this slide, but they should be just fine. So we see this would be the horse's foot, something that we all recognize. And I'm going to remove the lower border of this hoof wall. Being that it's a cadaver limb, I can do this. I would not attempt to do this on a live horse. So after removing the lower border of the wall, we now can see the sole. So we have our hoof wall and our sole. Now, another important thing that we need to consider is the leading edge of the sole that interfaces with the white line in the hoof wall. This is fairly uniform in its vertical depth. It is not 100% uniform, but it will vary between 1 or 2 millimeters. And it sets for a very good base for my research because I can now photograph a foot and get true measurements of the foot, not only externally but internally. If we should remove the hoof wall, now we can introduce to everyone the sensitive structures of the foot. These are sensitive laminal leaves, and they have nerve endings, they have vasculatures, arteries and veins. This would be our coronary cushion, and then between the distal border, oh, I should explain distal. That is a medical term. Distal is furthest away from the body. In other words, you could look at your hand and say my hand is distal from my shoulder. It just means that my hand's further away from the shoulder. So when I say the distal border of the wall, I'm talking about this portion. It's the furthest away from the body. This is very unique because it will be fairly uniform in its vertical depth. So it's a reliable source to use for my research because now I know my measurements are based on a standard. If I wanted to alter the foot by leaving length of wall, let's say in the heel area, that will alter the plane of the P3 bone and the plane of the hoof capsule. Would my measurements, by measuring the outside of the foot, would my measurements be true? When a foot is trimmed to the sole plane, you're looking, this is a trimming technique that is based on anatomy. But remember that this sensitive tissue is very fragile and delicate. We see this portion of the foot, and it looks tough to us, and we sometimes abuse it. But inside this portion is this very sensitive structure. So it has to deal with a lot of movements that take place when the horse is being used. It can have stress placed upon it, which will then, if the body is feeling some kind of stress coming from the sensory nerves, it will send down information to restructure it and make it a little tougher. So if I would like to look at the sole, since we'll be talking about the sole plane, we can look at the same. This is the sole. This is the sole out of this foot. And we can see how the structure is. We also now can introduce the sole plane. So when a foot is trimmed to the sole plane, it simply means eliminating length of wall and letting this horse stand on the ground the way nature dictates to how the horse is how the hoof wall is gonna wear. So we have to help counter nature in order to help the horse. Just because a foot wears a certain way doesn't mean it's a good thing. When we look at pathologies of the foot, pathology is the study of disease. We could see a lot of stress taking place on a barefoot horse because it cannot control the plane of its bone, and that has to be helped by farriers. Key note here is pathology can be based on the plane of the PIII bone. So let me put the bone on top of this sole, and we can see PIII bone and the sole. Now this bone is not exactly true in its position because we have a lot of soft tissue in this foot and a dermis. The dermis to the sole can be thick or thin. Different factors can develop a thicker or a thinner dermis. Usually thin-skinned horses have thinner dermises. Thick-skinned horses have thicker dermises. There's no absolutes, so I just say usually. So let's now go to our next slide and talk about the sole plane. And we're talking about this leading edge of this is a sole from a very young horse, very young. And what I'm talking about is the leading edge of the sole that runs around this area here. This would be your leading edge. This will interface with the white line and the hoof wall. And when it becomes, and it's very flexible. This is probably, this sole is a little dried out to be flexible. But when it's flexible, I can twist this in any direction I prefer to do. And then we can look at a horizontally planed hoof capsule. Again, when you trim to the sole plane, you're trimming to anatomy, and this horse now is standing on its foot based on its anatomy. If we were to have length of wall in the heel, then this foot would be standing on its toe area of the bone, and the bone will show stress. The sole dermis will show stress as time passes. And then the whole idea of this slide is notice that the sole plane is level. It is distortion free. The hoof capsule is flexible. And we can say that morphology, which represents shape, morphology is the study of shape. Well, the shape of a hoof capsule can change immediately. It's how fast it can change. When a foot is trimmed and the farrier walks back to shape a shoe and he comes back to the foot and he said, oh, his shoe doesn't fit now. He has to go back and reshape it. That's how fast this foot can change. So it can twist and bend. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the bending in the sole plane. So some very simple cartoon. Here we can demonstrate a hoof wall. We have the epidermal sole and the white line. We're going to talk about introduced length of wall, what that means. So the true foot ends at the distal border of the hard epidermal sole. So distal is the bottom. And this would be the bottom of the hard epidermal sole, the distal border, and that's where the true foot ends. If we look at length of wall beyond the sole plane, that simply means at the distal border of the sole. If we look at picture up here in the corner, we can now identify two parts to the heel. We have the true heel, which would be from the distal border of the sole to, if you want to take it to the hairline, you can, or you can take it to the top of the wall. But that's the true heel of a foot. This is length of wall. Whenever horses have wall length in the heel, it's a very negative thing for the foot, for the internal structures of the foot. So let's look at distortion in the distal border of the sole plane. So here we have a cadaver limb, and it's been trimmed to the sole plane and the wall removed, and we can, by using the term uniform sole thickness, we can see that this sole is fairly uniform. You know, this is like a 3-month-old horse, or somewhere up to 3 months, but look how uniform the sole is here. That's consistent. Again, it's not totally uniform, but it's a very reliable landmark. So when we trim the wall to the sole, length of wall to the sole plane, we know how the horse is standing on his foot, and it will be standing on a horizontal plane. How can I relate this to humans? If you have a shoe with heels, and you have to stand in those heels all day long, when you come home, the first thing you do is remove the heel or remove the shoes and stand on your foot. That's what you're seeing here. This horse is standing on his foot. It has no heel, has no length of wall in the toe because it's been removed. I shouldn't say it has no heel, because to me, this is the heel of the horse right here. That's the true heel. So this horse has heel. It just doesn't have length of wall in the heel. And they're more comfortable standing. Now we can look at another type of bend in the sole plane. This bend is bending upward, going up. Both of these bends are caused by length of wall in the heel. Although this foot is very common to find in hind feet. Why? Because the foot kind of runs forward. The wall, when the wall grows forward, it bends forward. And then that can pull this portion of the sole down. Now, a lot of front feet have an upward bend in the sole plane. Why is that? Because when the horse has length of wall in the heel, there's a space here, and when load comes into it, this can collapse or this can migrate upward. Now, I said this is normally common for hind feet, and this is common for front feet, but this happens to be the same foot. So you have both bends on the same foot, this being your lateral side and this being your medial side. Now they can switch back and forth. That's just how this particular horse developed. So I'd like to try to show some of the movements in this foot. So this foot has been trimmed to the sole plane, and I put a little piece of bar stock under the heel to represent length of wall. This bar stock is 1/4 inch or 0.25 inches. It's also 6.25 in millimeters. This would be about a week, on a healthy foot, this would be about a week's growth. So that's why trimming periods are very critical to horses. A horse that's trimmed every 5 weeks or greater is very hard to help him, because the wall's always growing, and then it has to pick up with these different internal movements. The forces are greater on how the internal movements develop. So the more often your horse is trimmed and shod, the least problems you will have with feet. I see a lot of horseshoers being blamed for sore feet, when in reality, it's the use of the horse that's creating damage to the soft tissue, overusing the horse, heavy body weight, heavy rider's weight. Put a heavy person and a heavy body weight on a horse, you're pretty much going to destroy the foot, especially on lighter breeds. So keep that in mind, that this is all subject to gravity. Something we should always remember is gravity always wins. So let me put this foot in motion, and what I would like you to look for two things. One, watch watch the distortion, this movement here in this area. And after you notice that moving a little bit, and you will see a little bit of blood come out of here. That simply means that the tissue is being compressed and is pushing the blood around. The next thing you can look at is this area here. It will be moving upward. Now, not very much, but every foot is different. And let's remember, there's no absolutes. They don't have to do this, but we're setting them up to this when we leave wall length in the heel. So let me put this in motion and watch this area right here. Coming down, you see how it's dropping down and bending down? So it's already starting to develop a small downward bend in the sole plane. But let's watch this area. You see how it's forcing this foot to the wall to move up and then come back down? That's all naturally occurring when a horse has length of wall under its foot. This shiny that you see in the toe here is used. Keratinized tissue should be dull in color. So when you see shiny strips coming down through that wall, there's generally stress taking place internally. So now we can look at two different heel lengths of wall. I'm going to put a marker in here, and that's our frog wall junction. Now this is a very unique thing about a horse's foot, because the frog wall junction will align with the internal structures of the foot when we talk about the moisture line. So it again is a very reliable landmark, but we can't always trim to the frog wall junction because we have other issues to look at. So keep that in mind. In other words, we can't always trim length of wall off the heel as much as we would like to today, because the heel internally has to adjust slowly to our trim. So if you're going fast and taking too much heel, you most likely are going to have a horse walking off a little sore. So you need to take that in your stride and go, well, the horse already has it in its stride, doesn't it? But we need to take that in our stride and learn to go slow when we're adjusting a foot. Farriers trim differently. It's rare to find two farriers that trim of the foot the same. So whenever a horse owner trains a farrier, they're having new signals put into how that horse is standing on its foot. And that's going to have stress on the tissue within the leg. Sometimes you can have a sore horse walking a little sore and then retrim the foot and it walks off sound. Well, you've made an adjustment. But sometimes you can trim a sound foot and it walks off lame. That simply means your trim most likely was a little bit different than the last trim or the last farrier, and that will cause stress to tendons and ligaments, and especially your collateral ligaments of your navicular bone. Those are short, very strong tendons or ligaments. And if you alter the foot by, what we say, 6.25 millimeters, more than on one side than the other, you can stress those ligaments or take the heels down too much. Those ligaments aren't going to open up that fast. So go slow and allow time for tissue to adjust. Horses need some good physical therapy when you're changing a walking therapy when you're changing a trimming technique. I would not advise riding the horse the day it was trimmed. It needs to stretch all the tissue out as it walk the horse maybe after it's been trimmed gently, and allow time for this tissue to stretch and readjust to its new trim. But by using these landmarks now, we can see that this heel is longer than this heel. So that will alter the plane of the hoof capsule. That's going to dump it over or push it over onto the lateral, this is the lateral, so it'll be off onto the lateral toe quarter. Long wall here can put the foot in a roll position, and it can put the foot in a yaw position or diagonal roll into that toe area, which can cause stress and damage. Let me repeat, pathology can be based on the plane of the PIII bone. So here we've trimmed the heels, we've trimmed to the sole plane, and as you can see, we weren't quite able to get to our landmark on this foot. That's because the heel told us to stop. The tissue in the seat of corn area said stop, don't go any further. So we did. But what did we discover? A bend in the sole plane. You see, this bend starts from here to here. This wall should be touching the platform, and it's not because it's in an upward bend. Now, these bends can be long, like this one, or they can be short. The short ones take a long time to remove. The long ones remove fairly fast. So this is, again, the rib portion of the foot, and we can see how much distance is put into this foot. This horse does not have body weight. So the bend, this is how great the bend is, because this heel's touch, oops. This is how great the bend is. This heel's on the ground. This one is not. So we have to look at a few things to identify other tissues that are involved with this much movement. If we look over here, descending weight has lowered this. If I would have put this into mid-stance phase, then this heel most likely would be touching the ground. As it comes off mid-stance, depending on the severity of the bend, it will probably spring back. It takes a shoeing or two to level a bend in the sole plane. Sometimes they will level in one trimming. Other times it may take 2 or 3 trimmings, depending on the severity of the bend. So all of this, look closely at all this tissue. It's all laying inward. It's closing the gap between the hoof wall and the center of the foot. Look at this side. It's open. The heel's on the ground. This is laying out. It's comfortable. This is pushed up. It's crowding the ungual cartilages of the foot, and it's crowding this area. It's closing this space. Remember that when the bones move, they have to, in gait, in walking or running, the pastern bones have to fall down between the ungual cartilages, and this tissue now is stressed. So we have to be very careful on how we look at where our work goes. Another thing you can notice, that this heel, when we put to a descending body weight, this heel is lowering, it's settling down. So it's starting to open up. It's already, to a trained eye, it's already looking better than what we see here. So that's the movements of a sheared heel, moving up and down. And also, if it's very minute, but you can see that this cleft is even opening up a little bit. So let's put this onto a movement. I will load this limb, and we will see how the movement takes place. Did you see how it opened up when I loaded the limb? It fell. This is a positive thing because we're going away. The length of wall in the heel is always a negative thing to do to a horse's foot. That will make the horse so uncomfortable that maybe it doesn't want to pick its foot up for the farrier because it relates that this farrier is trimming me with all his heel and my feet hurt. Get away from me. You've all seen it. But yet the trainer or the owner can pick the foot up really easy. So pay attention. Different trimming techniques can really damage a horse's foot and cause a lot of pain. That pain just doesn't end the foot. It goes all the way to the muscles and to the sore backs. It can go all the way to the brain. You ever watch a farrier that's having a hard time catching a horse in a stall? Look at this trimming technique. Yet the trainer can go and pick it up quite easily. A horse will tell you more about your farrier than you will be able to know. So pay attention to your horse and how it reacts when the farrier is trying to pick up its foot. Although I have to, in defense of, it may not have been that farrier that started the original pain, putting the heels on. It may have been another farrier prior, but horses remember things quite well. Whenever a veterinarian has to give a shot 5 days in a row, the first shot is easy. On the 5th day, he needs help to catch the horse. That's how they remember. So if your farrier is hurting a foot, the horse will tell you, get him away from me. So let's continue. I got a little off track. So I'm going to the next slide. We'll go back to the closed up, the heel that's closing in. Now watch carefully because this will go quite fast. And when I move to the next slide, you see how it all opens up. So that's how critical trimming techniques have to be. We have to understand the effects they have on the foot because they will have great effects on the body. How can a horse be comfortable working if his feet hurt? Some horses, very subtle. It's very subtle to see a foot hurting on the horse, but the horse will tell you. Now we can look at the bottom of the foot trimmed to the sole plane. It's a very distorted foot. Any farrier that sees that, they'll know, well, that's distorted. Well, farriers have been trained to trim a level foot. So in that case, they would miss all of this. They wouldn't know this sole plane was distorted. Why are they trained to trim a level foot? Because they also have to make a level shoe to go on a level foot. That way they don't, supposedly, they don't lose shoes. And yet we all know they lose shoes with a level foot and a level shoe. So this is taking farrier science to another level. We need to understand all of these little distortions in the foot and in the capsule so we can prevent a lot of this damage that's taking place to that sensitive, fragile tissue that's inside the foot. Now there's a method called floating a heel. So this foot has been floated, as they would say, and I have to admit it's a rather large float because to show movement you do have to exaggerate things. If I did a light float, it would be a very little movement. You're still getting the movement. So I'm going to put this, oh, another thing is, in order to float this heel, what did the farrier do? He trimmed to the sole plane here. But the only way you can raise the heel is you have to leave length of wall beyond the sole plane to raise the heel to have this gap. So if this foot was trimmed to the sole plane, then this trim would be up, all this length of wall would be removed, and the horse would be standing on a solid base. So let me put this in motion, and we can see the movements that take place on a floated heel. You see, it's going to keep falling until it bottoms out onto that metal, or until something stops it, and then it will return. Look at another thing that's happening. Look how much the horse is losing its toe. Look at the movement that's taking place in that toe. It's coming off the shoe. Another issue is the nail. I did not clench these nails because I knew if I clenched them, the nail would bend and then it would put pressure on the sensitive tissue on the inside when it bends. So I left the clench open to show that all of this is moving. The nail is this object. So when the heel falls, that nail will come out of the ground or loosen the clenches, one or the other. But a strong clench can prevent the nail from lifting out of the foot, and that will cause the nail to bend or buckle. And if it goes into the direction, which it most likely will, into the sensitive tissue, then most likely you're going to see a lot of heavy dark spots on the edge of the sole, on the leading edge of the sole when you pull the shoe off. So this is a downward bend. Here we see a downward bend in the sole. This foot was trimmed to the sole plane. It just follows the white line, so it trims out like this. Now, it's a downward bend in the sole plane. So what I'm going to do is put this on load to see, is it possible to level the sole plane? So when we put it on load, we can see that the forces that are taking place are changing the dynamics of this foot. It's changing the sole plane, and it's causing the sole plane to level. So that's some of the things we need to consider in advanced farrier science. We're trying to move our farrier science industry more into a modern farrier science. Let's get more science put into our work so we can study things like this and be able to help horses even more. So this is really what I was talking about here, all of this movement. There's a lot here to talk about. If we have to be careful or we could cause damage someplace else. For every action, there's a reaction. So always be aware. You have to think. You need a good independent thought to figure out, if I do this, what are the negatives and what are the positives. So I'd like to thank you for this little discussion on distortion to the sole plane. Like I say, it is critical as far as hoof health goes that we can maintain a level sole plane. That takes the stress off of the soft tissue and off of the bone, the P3 bone. Everything's connected. And if one thing is moving in the wrong direction, it's going to influence all of the other things that are attached to the tissue that's attached to that tissue. So thank you again.